Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hey friends, and welcome to our next episode in this deep dive into social doctrine. So, today, we are continuing our discussion of the human person. What is the human person? And what is human nature? And how does human nature give rise to our human rights? So, to recap, in our last episode, we considered human nature and human dignity. So we talked about how human beings are not like other animals. They are made in the image of God, i.e., we have an intellect and a will, which makes us persons. So not just something, but someone. This is what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God. And this capacity for intellect and free will allows us to enter into communion with other people, as well as to form a covenant with God, our Creator. Now, the fact that we are made in the image of God has implications for the whole human person and for social doctrine by extension. So what we see when we look at the human person is all these different dimensions and aspects of humanity that arise out of this fundamental fact that we're made in the image of God. These different dimensions of the human person. And these dimensions of the human person all need to be understood in order for us to understand church social doctrine. In other words, the human person is multifaceted and complex, and this complexity arises out of our human nature. And the compendium of social doctrine talks about how it's really important that we understand the full complexity of the human person, because if we don't have that understanding, what we can end up doing is reducing the human person to kind of oversimplified ideas. And when we oversimplify the person, we can end up falling into one of two extremes. So point 124 of the compendium says that reductionist conceptions of the human person make the image of man unclear by emphasizing only one of his characteristics at the expense of all the others. So in other words, we have this tendency at times when we don't fully understand the different dimensions of the human person and the full complexity of the human person, we have this tendency to oversimplify humanity. And when we do that, we tend to assume one of two things. And this is something that the compendium goes into. The first is that we can overemphasize the kind of individualism of the human person. So we can treat human beings as just radically individual. Every single person is like an island. Every single person has their own rights and freedoms, and they exist kind of apart from everyone else. And we start to overemphasize individualism and freedom at the expense of the rest of society. The other end of the spectrum is a kind of mass mentality, treating the human person as a kind of anonymous cog in the machine, and sort of putting human beings into boxes or categories, anonymizing them and treating them as all the same, or even as unimportant or disposable. So those are the two extreme ends of the spectrum that we can fall into: radical individualism or a kind of mass mentality. And the compendium talks about how these errors arise out of an incomplete understanding of the full complexity of the human person. So the compendium says, the Church's social doctrine strives to indicate the different dimensions of the mystery of man, who must be approached in the full truth of his existence, of his personal being, and also of his community and social being. So it's basically saying that we need to understand that full complex picture of the human person, and that social doctrine arises out of that. So that's what we're going to do in today's episode. We're going to think about all the different dimensions or facets of the human person that arise out of the fact that every person is made in the image of God. The first being freedom. Every human person is free. And we kind of touched on this in our last episode, that because we have an intellect and a will, we have this capacity to direct our passions, to override our instincts, and to make free moral choices. So because we have this capacity to make moral choices, we have the ability to become good, like morally good, not just good in the sense of like, I don't know, fit and healthy and physically well, but morally good. We are able to shape our character and our personalities to conform to the good. Now, paradoxically, and this is something that we touched on in earlier episodes, so if you want to think more about freedom, you can look at episodes 27 and 73. But just to recap here, paradoxically, the human person, we are the most free when we conform ourselves freely to the moral good, to truth. So I think I've used this quote before because I love it, but this is how John Paul II puts it. He says, freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought. So we have this capacity to act freely, but we are our most free when we pursue the truth, when we do what we ought. And so the classic kind of analogy to explain this is, I can get in a car and technically speaking, I have the freedom to do whatever I want. Okay, I can push any button I like. I can drive on whichever side of the road I want. I can go as fast or slow as I want. Technically speaking, I have the freedom, the capacity to do whatever I want with the car. However, if I do just start pressing random buttons and driving on the wrong side of the road and going 50 kilometers over the speed limit, there is every likelihood that I will end up seriously injured, if not dead. And in fact, the more I use the car in accordance with how it is made, I kind of follow the rules of how you should use the car, and I follow the road rules. I drive on the right side of the road. I drive within the speed limit. The more I kind of follow the rules, the more free I am. The further I can drive, the more I can drive unhindered. I will be safe from danger. I'm not going to get a speeding fine. So the more I conform to the rules, the more free I am. And we can say something similar about morality. The more we seek out and conform ourselves to truth, the more we become free. And on the flip side, the more we deviate from the moral good, the more we kind of just do whatever we want and do things that go against truth, the more inhibited we become, the less free we are. So this is how the compendium puts it. It says, by deviating from the moral law, man violates his own freedom, becomes imprisoned within himself, disrupts neighborly fellowship, and rebels against divine truth. So I think anyone who has ever struggled with any kind of addiction will attest to this, that the more we do something that we know isn't right, the more we are imprisoned within ourselves. Now, all of this has implications for social life and not just for my individual life. So the compendium talks about how when individual people don't use their freedom responsibly and in the pursuit of truth and goodness, when we're all kind of doing whatever we want and violating the natural law or making up our own rules, the compendium says the consequence is that freedom dies, destroying man and society. So in a nutshell, it's basically saying that sin has social consequences. It doesn't just have consequences for me, it affects the people around me. And the more people in a society are not conforming to the truth, the more society as a whole starts to break down. We start to hurt one another. We start to mistreat one another. We see less and less freedom in society as a whole. So every person has this capacity and this need to pursue truth and goodness for the sake of ourselves and for the sake of society. Now, in order to pursue the truth freely, we also, this is like, it comes full circle, we also need to be free. Okay, so what do I mean by that? What I mean is, the human person kind of inherently has this capacity for freedom, but also we require external conditions that will allow us to seek the truth and to conform ourselves to the truth and to morality. So the compendium says, man can turn to good only in freedom. It also says in point 137 that the proper exercise of personal freedom requires specific conditions of an economic, social, juridic, political, and cultural order. Okay, so basically what it's saying is that societies need to be structured in such a way that individual human beings are given the space and the freedom to seek and pursue truth and the moral good. So the compendium says that man's dignity demands that he act according to a knowing and free choice that is personally motivated and prompted from within, neither under blind internal impulse nor by mere external pressure. Okay, so the human person has this interior freedom, this capacity to make moral choices, but in order to be able to fully exercise that interior freedom, we also require external social conditions that facilitate the use of our freedom. So we'll talk about this more when we think about human rights in more concrete terms. But basically what we're talking about is things like freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. However, these freedoms are not totally limitless, nor should they be totally limitless. So this is the kind of flip side. If the human person is free, that means that he is also responsible. And again, this is something we've talked about in episodes 27 and 73. But basically, the fact that we have this capacity to make free moral choices means that we can also be held responsible for those choices. So our actions have consequences and we can be held responsible for those consequences. So while societies need to allow people the freedom to seek and pursue truth, societies also need to hold people responsible for the free moral choices that they make. There may be consequences for the things that I do, and it is just for a society to enforce those consequences. And again, this is something that we will kind of nut out in greater depth when we start talking about human rights. Okay, so every person is free and every person is responsible. Another facet of the human person that arises out of our human nature is the fact that every person has the capacity to access the transcendent. So what is the transcendent? The transcendent refers to things that exist beyond matter. So things like truth, goodness, and beauty. And ultimately, when we talk about these transcendent things, we're talking about God at the end of the day. But truth, goodness, and beauty are all attributes of God. Okay, so the person, because we have an intellect and because we have free will, we are able to kind of transcend the material world and enter the world of the abstract, the spiritual, the transcendent. As well as that, we have the capacity to transcend our own selves, the sort of material reality of myself, and connect with another person. We have the capacity to empathize, to give ourselves freely to one another. So what does this all mean in terms of social doctrine? Well, basically, it means that in every society, human persons should have access to the transcendentals, to truth, goodness, and beauty. Societies should provide space for these things, for art, for culture, for philosophy. A society that becomes purely a kind of economic machine and deadens the human person's capacity for the transcendent is one that doesn't respect the full mystery of the human person. As well as that, because we have this capacity to transcend ourselves and to connect with one another, we also need to live in societies that encourage community and connection between people. And we'll go into that more when we talk about the human person as a social being. Okay, the next kind of dimension of the human person is the fact that every human being is unique and unrepeatable. So the compendium in point 131 says, man exists above all as a subjective entity, as a center of consciousness and freedom, whose unique life experiences, comparable to those of no one else, underlie the inadmissibility of any attempt to reduce his status by forcing him into preconceived categories or power systems, whether ideological or otherwise. Basically what that quote is saying is that every single person has their own unique experiences, their own unique life and decisions and interiority. And because we have an intellect, because we have free will, we can shape our personalities and our characters. And what that means is that every single human being is utterly unique. We can never say that, this type of person is like this, or every person who has experienced this is this kind of person. We can never basically put people into little boxes or categories or generalize about groups of people, because every single individual human person, they might have similar experiences, but they might respond very differently to those experiences. Every person's consciousness and mind is different and differently formed. So we can think about any of the categories that we often put people into. And categories in and of themselves aren't a bad thing. But when we start to generalize about people according to those categories and say, well, anyone who's in that category of person, they're all the same, and we can treat them all the same, we can respond to them all the same, then we fall into the danger of slipping into that kind of mass mentality and generalizing about human beings, when in reality, every human person is unique and unrepeatable. So the compendium goes on to say that this uniqueness entails above all the requirement not only of simple respect on the part of others, especially political and social institutions and their leaders with regard to every man and woman on earth, but even more, the primary commitment of each person towards others, and particularly of these same institutions, must be for the promotion and integral development of the person. So that's a bit of a hefty quote. Basically what it's saying is that individual human people owe respect to every single person that they encounter. We can never approach other people making assumptions about them or categorizing them or generalizing about them. We owe respect to every single person that we encounter, and we need to show respect for their uniqueness and their unrepeatability. But this also applies to political and social institutions and their leaders. So within societies, we need institutions that show respect for the individual uniqueness of every single person, the dignity of every single person. So again, this is something we'll go into in more depth when we talk about human rights. But one example of this is having legal and social structures that protect against discrimination, that prevent people from being reduced to their race or class or gender or ideology. Anything that reduces someone to a category and ignores their individuality and their uniqueness overlooks the complexity and dignity of the human person. So on a related note, another dimension of the human person is the fact that every human person has equal dignity. No matter who you are, no matter where you are in the world, what your experiences are, whether you're a man or a woman, no matter what kind of category you might be put into, every single individual human person has equal human dignity. Another way of saying this is saying that no one human life is worth more than any other. Every single human person has equal worth, and that should be respected in the way that societies are constructed. Now, respecting the equal dignity of every human person doesn't mean ensuring that every single human person does all of the exact same things or is treated in the exact same way. In fact, applying that kind of sameness to every human being can actually lead us into that mass mentality where everyone is just the same. So we're not saying like equal dignity doesn't mean that every single person has to be treated exactly the same. What we are saying is that the dignity and worth of every single human person must be respected in a society. So one manifestation of this, the compendium talks about in point 133. It says, the person cannot be a means of carrying out economic, social, or political projects, even in the name of an alleged progress of the civil community as a whole, or of other persons either in the present or future. So what it's saying there is that we can never sacrifice the rights of one person for the sake of other people or for the sake of an economic, social, or political project. And we kind of touched on this in the last episode. And here, the compendium is placing particular emphasis on the fact that we can never sacrifice one person's rights for the sake of other people's rights. So, for instance, we could never say that for the sake of the majority of people in a society, we need to mistreat and abuse a minority of people. So, for instance, we could think of something like chattel slavery. We can't legitimately make an argument for saying, well, we need to enslave this group of people because if we don't, then the rest of society isn't going to flourish. So we need to override the rights of these people because we're trying to achieve the good for the majority. I think I've used this example ages ago, but in one of the Marvel films, there's a character who basically decides that the universe is overpopulated and there's not enough resources for everyone. So in order to make sure that the majority of people flourish, he is going to wipe out half of the universe. He's going to kill off half of the people because then the other people will be able to flourish. So that's a kind of extreme example of sacrificing the rights of some for the sake of the rights of others. So we return to this idea that no human life has more worth than any other. Every human life is worth the same. Every human person has dignity, and that dignity should be upheld. And we never have the right to squash someone's rights or dignity, even if it's one person. Even if we, like, let's say we had to torture one person or enslave one person. And by doing that, we would guarantee the flourishing of every single other person on the entire planet. That would still not be legitimate, because that one person who we've decided to torture or enslave has just the same worth as every other person in the world. So we can never sacrifice their good for the sake of everyone else's. Okay, another dimension of the human person is the fact that every person is a unity of body and soul. So we talked about how because we have an intellect and will, we can access the transcendent and the realm of the spiritual. At the same time, we are flesh and blood. We are material beings as well as spiritual. And in fact, this is something that makes human beings utterly unique, this union of body and soul, because some beings are pure spirit, so angels, and others, they don't have a spiritual soul. So for instance, dogs and cats. But we human beings, we are both body and soul, and our body and our soul are inextricably entwined. So point 129 of the compendium says, man has two different characteristics. He is a material being linked to this world by his body, and he is a spiritual being open to transcendence. And both of these things are equally true of us. So what does this mean in terms of social doctrine? Well, what it means is that our societies need to cater for both the spiritual and the physical in every human being. So for instance, if we had a society in which we prioritized the spiritual transcendent elements of the human person by providing access to the arts and philosophy and education and literature, but we were neglecting the material needs of persons, so we weren't catering for the needs of the poor, we were neglecting the homeless and the vulnerable, we had a healthcare system that wasn't able to meet the basic material needs of people, then there would be something wrong in that society. We need both to be in balance. And vice versa, if we have a world where physically everyone is doing really well, we've got a great healthcare system, we've got economic prosperity, people eat well, their physical needs are met, but we're not encouraging the arts and philosophy and transcendence. We're not creating an environment where people are encouraged and enabled to seek and pursue truth and goodness and beauty. Well, then we would have an imbalance in the other direction. So the material needs of human beings need to always be held in balance with their transcendent spiritual needs as well. And then the final dimension of the human person that we're going to look at is the fact that every human is a social being. So this is something that arises out of the fact that human beings have this capacity to transcend the self and connect with others and enter into communion with other people. The fact that we have this capacity makes us social beings. We are beings who cannot just live in a bubble. So point 149 of the compendium says the human person is essentially a social being. So I like that word essentially. It's saying that like this is part of the essence of what it is to be human. This isn't an add-on. This isn't a nice extra that we can also be social beings. This is part of our essence. The human being is essentially a social being. And then it says, the human person is for this reason called from the very beginning to life in society. God did not create man as a solitary being, but wished him to be a social being. Social life, therefore, is not exterior to man. He can only grow and realize his vocation in relation with others. So again, emphasizing that this is something that is inherent in the human person. This isn't an optional extra. This isn't a nice to have. Our social, and I think everyone kind of experienced this during lockdown when a lot of people were isolated. We felt it, right? The consequences of that disconnect, of being socially cut off from other people, of not having community. People really, really suffered. And that's not because they were overreacting or they were being bratty. It's because they were feeling a lack of something that is inherent in the human person, that is totally necessary to ourselves. John Paul II puts it even more strikingly in his encyclical Redemptor Hominis. He says, "Man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible for himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not participate intimately in it." So John Paul II here is talking about that communion with other people, that mutual self-giving and concern for the other that we call love. Every person is made for that. And he says, without love, we remain beings incomprehensible for ourselves. So we can't even understand ourselves. We can't develop properly as human beings if we do not interact with other people. There's this great line in Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, where the character Cassius says to another character, Brutus, he says, "The eye sees not itself, but by reflection, by some other thing." So he's talking about how, like, you can only see your own eyes when they're reflected back to you if you look in a mirror. And he kind of uses that as an analogy of the human person, that we can't actually understand ourselves except through our relationships with other people, because through our relationships with other people, we learn from that person, through our empathy and our communion with them, what it is to be a human person. And also through our social relations with them, we learn about ourselves as well. They reflect things back to us and teach us things about ourselves that we can't discover just by remaining by ourselves, in the same way that it's impossible for the eye to see itself unless it looks at something that reflects back to it. So humans are essentially social beings. This is inherent in us. So what does that mean for societies? Well, what that means is that societies need to encourage and allow for community life and social life. And first and foremost, societies need to promote the family, because the family is that first place where we experience love and communion and connection, and we start to learn what it is to be a human person. Okay, so to recap, we've talked about a few different dimensions of the human person. We've talked about freedom. We've talked about responsibility, the capacity to access the transcendent, uniqueness and unrepeatability, equality, so equal dignity, a unity of body and soul, and social life, the fact that every person is a social being and needs to experience love and communion. So all of these facets of the human person need to be taken into account when we're thinking about how we structure societies. And we can see, considering all these dimensions of the human person, how if we neglect one of them, then we develop that distorted view. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. In our next episode, we're going to talk about human rights. So we've started by talking about what is human nature. And then if you think of this as like a kind of an inverted pyramid, right? We've started with the essential thing, human nature, what it is to be made in the image of God. And then we've kind of grown out of that into the dimensions of the human person that arise out of our human nature. And then from there, we're going to build up and think about, okay, what are our human rights? Because our human rights arise out of our human nature. Once we understand what a human person is, then we can start to understand what every single person has a right to by virtue of the fact that they are human. So that's going to be our next episode. Awesome. Okay, well, I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. This is such fun. I can't wait to talk about human rights. Have a fantastic fortnight, and I will talk to you later. Okay, bye. Hey friends, thanks for listening to this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast and you would like to see it continue and reach many more people, then I invite you to consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the show notes of this episode. There are many running costs associated with running a podcast, and I rely 100% on the generosity of patrons. Thank you so much to those who already support the podcast. And most importantly, please continue to pray for me and for all of those who are listening.